In all the years I've been playing RPGs, first-person perspective dungeon crawlers have never really appealed to me for a couple of reasons. The first is that I always imagined them to be an exercise in aimless wandering with no real urgent objective other than to, well, perpetually wander. The second is that as a lover of stories and character development in my games, I couldn't fathom how a dungeon crawler could keep my attention in that department when the focus was on a huge winding maze rather than the people traveling within it. When I was looking into games in the Shining series, I thought that Shining in the Darkness was just another turn-based strategy adventure like the others on the Genesis, but I was wrong. It would be the game that not only introduced me to the genre as a whole, but also made me fall a little bit in love with it. The setting is the Kingdom of Thornwood. Princess Jessa is granted permission by her father to leave the castle to attend a nearby shrine, but only under the careful watch of his best knight, Mordred. After the two depart, they extend the outing to the looming labyrinth as Mordred regales many stories about the training grounds within. As the day turns to night and more time slips away, neither are heard from again. The king, overcome with fear of the worst, permits you, Mordred's son, to enter the great dungeon to find your father and the missing princess. After a short briefing, you're shoved out of the castle and into the front door of the labyrinth to begin the search. I was surprised that even by the game's end, these walls and a few other variations on this view were more or less all that you get to stare at the entire time. There were no bustling towns to visit, no sprawling overworlds to explore, and nothing much else to take in outside of this building. In other RPGs, I look forward to the change in the setting as I fan out from the starting area, and I was worried about getting bored with these passageways as the main event. Not only is the visual experience small in breadth, it's literally tiny. Only a small proportion of the game's interface is dedicated to showcasing your surroundings. They left space on the top and the bottom to show the action menu and the character stats, and on one hand, I guess that sort of makes sense. How many details do you really need for bricks and stones and logs and the same repetitive walls and floors? I'm not sure if the decision was made because of a limitation rather than planned that way for aesthetics preferences, but first-person perspective dungeons in older games like the original Phantasy Star took advantage of the entire screen even if they were a lot less detailed. While I could forgive a more limited view when it came to the building, I was disappointed with it when it came to the random encounter enemies, which were the other main visual highlight. These are the bread and butter of the game, and you'll immediately be sent to the realm of the afterlife if you don't approach the first few battles you stumble into carefully. You start out fighting very low-level enemies like slimes and slugs, but you're also extremely low-level. The first handful of fights will be those intense blow-for-blow scenarios where you'll be hovering on the edge of your seat waiting to see if you'll outlast your opponent, and you'd better be ready to run if more than one enemy shows up. These are menu-based random encounters, and until you track down your other party members, you'll be relying heavily on the main character's physical attacks and restorative items that you can buy or find to inch your way to new parts of the labyrinth. As the experience starts trickling in and the stat gains start to build, you'll be able to go further and longer without having to retreat to town every few minutes. It's slow to start out, but it's really just the very tip of a huge iceberg of a quest that you'll undertake. Your other party members come to you fairly early on and bring a much-needed balance to the group, not only for more life bars to work through to a game over, but also for the skills that they offer. Milo and Pyra are primarily opposite-spectrum spellcasters, and Pyra learns the very important View spell early on in her leveling arc. It only costs 1 magic point to cast and shows you your coordinates on the labyrinth floor that you're on, as well as where you've already traveled. I chose to map each section by hand, which was an enormous undertaking all said and done. Every single floor is 30 by 30, with many hallways leading to dead ends, pitfalls, and secrets. A really nice layout perk is that all areas of the labyrinth that are directly related to one another are stacked on top of each other physically. So if you take a stairwell up to a specific coordinate, for example, you'll start there on the floor above. Having that point of reference made mapping a breeze, with a single step being a single square on grid paper. I did find it annoying to have map access behind a paywall of sorts, and it would have been nice to be able to call it up without spending out MP. I'm someone that needed to double check my map often. I'd lose count of how many steps I'd taken while pushing through an endless barrage of random battles and wasted a lot of magic points because of that. A few of my maps got a little out of whack, but I guess having an in-game option for accessing those views was better than the alternative of having none. The labyrinth's floors open up gradually, and while it might seem like there are way too many places to get stuck with no idea how to progress, the crews in the castle's main chamber or at the tavern are always there to dish out directives and hints to get to the next leg of the journey. They'll fill you in on items you need to find or places to scour for clues, but throughout your travels, if you're paying attention, you'll notice lots of doors or jail cells that you can't open yet. And if you're mapping, you might see big blank spots you can't seem to access from any direction that might be worth returning to check out later. The further you venture away from an entry point on a new floor, the more difficult the enemy encounters become, and Shining in the Darkness will not hesitate to flatten you. If you're underprepared when facing off with a new enemy type, you're almost guaranteed to either barely survive or perish and get kicked back out to the shrine for revival. And if you get into hot water and forgot to bring a feather or can't cast exit to get back to town, the encounter rate will get you. You can even trigger battles turning around in place, and every step in the wrong direction might be your last. Mercy is fleeting, but there's also a great sense of risk versus reward with exploration. You can really push your resources, and it makes for some very exciting gameplay in what is otherwise a very rote RPG experience. As much as the enemies can feel overwhelming at times, their design was one of the best features. There are palette swaps galore, but I was impressed at how diverse the visuals of the very menacing sprites were. They got more and more fantastical the further I wound into the dungeon, but I suppose with how much exploring you do and how much distance there is to cover, battle variety is the only spice to sprinkle on top of the wall simulator screensaver aesthetic. Many of the foes are your generic slimes, bats, and goblins, but I was impressed by how differently many of these groups played out in terms of strategy. You have all of your typical jerks here: poisoners, hard hitters, elemental casters, just to name a few, but combinations of certain groups were ruthless, like those that could cast sleep and instant death to take you down. These battles aren't the kind that you can just mash attack through to be successful. You really need to pay attention to what you're fighting and learn how to manage the more brutal enemies, lest you meet a terrible fate at the hands of dream puffs, jackobutches, or man-apes. Apart from the regular random encounters, there were extremely strong recurring enemies that appeared on their designated floors to murder you. In a way, some of these were mini-bosses that occasionally revealed quest-related items after they were defeated, but most of the time they were just there to mess you up. There aren't many boss encounters in the traditional sense, where you have some dialogue and face off with the big bad or their henchmen that have been dispatched to ensure your party's demise. Instead, you get ambushed by these monsters just from exploring, though they do tend to always appear in the same general areas of the floors, but not every time you pass by or exactly in the same spot. Shining in the Darkness did provide some great defensive strategies in the forms of party buff spells that work beautifully. Without quicker boost, there's no way that I could have come close to winning face-offs the first time I encountered them. I even used these spells against some very strong regular enemies that warranted it, though it was hard to justify using up those precious magic points. There are practically no MP restoring items until very late in the game, which is a gripe I have with many RPGs from this time. Unlike other games where several characters overlap in basic magic skill sets, like curative spells for example, Shining in the Darkness only delegates these to one person. Everyone can carry items that have the same effect as some of the more important spells, but we'll talk about inventory in a moment. In the case of paralysis, for example, Milo's the only person that learns how to cure it with a spell. For some reason, when the random battle roulette wheel of status ailments was spun, Milo always seemed to be the lucky one on the receiving end. He was regularly asleep or poisoned in late game, and if he got struck with paralysis, nobody else could help him. It does eventually wear off on its own, but it was usually too late by the time it did. The encounter rate's so high that I was likely to wipe from not being able to cure or heal with Milo long before he came around or I could get to safety. So why not carry a ton of smelling salts around then? Well, the inventory space, or a lack thereof, was an enormous problem. Each character can only carry up to 8 items, and that includes spots that are reserved for equipment. You have 4 slots for a weapon, armor, a head covering, and a shield or equivalent, so really that only leaves 4 spaces in each inventory for everything else: healing items, crafting materials, special quest items, keys, and so on. Deep into the game, there are just some things that you can't do without, and you'll have to make some tough decisions on what you think you might need before every trip into the maze. This also stifles the excitement of exploration. If you're planning to survey every inch of the labyrinth for the riches deep within, you likely won't have room to carry most of it out with you. There's no home base area with storage for overflow items, but there is an expensive workaround. You can sell your equipment or special items to any of the shop owners, and if you realize you need something later on, you can always buy it back. Money wasn't really an issue since I did a lot of accidental level grinding as I wandered, but knowing what to keep in my inventory the first time through was rough. Because I didn't know what I'd need, I couldn't justify parting ways with anything, even temporarily. It was the worst feeling to leave something like a key behind and then realize that I needed to unlock a door at the end of a long stretch of difficult dungeon, have to warp back out, buy it back, and do it all over again. The weapons and armor system in Shining in the Darkness is barely straightforward since it suffers from a problem that many other games from this era do. You never know if the stuff you're buying or have found is better than what you already have until it's in your inventory and you equip it. At the beginning of the game when you're relying on the armorer, more expensive items generally have better stats and the manual lays out who can use what and for how much very nicely. This chart only takes you so far though, and soon you'll be discovering chests with items that you have no idea about price or stats wise. This also extends to other objects whose functions aren't mentioned anywhere outside of guides online. If you're not using a guide, your choice is to haul these mysterious things around with you, taking up that precious inventory space and blindly experiment to piece together what they do. You can use the vision spell to get some information, but the MP cost isn't worth the prize of some vague sentences that really don't say much at all. Some free in-game descriptions or even an item list in the manual would have been a huge help. Partway through the game, you'll start finding objects that can be used for armor and weapon crafting. This is an exciting idea in principle, but the guy at the shop tells you absolutely nothing about what he'll make for you. He just demands a ton of cash and some of your finite materials, and you end up rolling the dice on whether or not you'll like what he makes you better than your current equipment. I sometimes ended up crafting things that were weaker than what I already had, or had attributes that I just didn't want to contend with in battle. Another thing that's not made clear in this game is that you can have items made for the hero that other characters can use, and there's some of the best. The way the questions are set up when you order implies things can only be made for one person and used only by them, or at least that's how I interpreted it going through. This is all to say that nothing about crafting felt straightforward, and I think it would have felt a lot more useful with a bit more thoughtfulness in how it was implemented. Despite a short list of negatives I've mentioned alongside some of the good here, I really enjoyed Shining in the Darkness as a whole. The little bits of plot that flowed at important points in the game weren't as engaging as other RPG experiences, but I still got a good sense of many side characters and my main party through interactions with people in the town and at the castle. The story was surprisingly moving at times and had more depth than I ever imagined it could. I mentioned earlier that good writing and characters are usually the big draws for me in an RPG, but here I didn't need those things to be the best of the best. There was enough packed into this rudimentary formula of endless walking that kept me interested to see what was around the next corner and the next after that. Between the challenging battles and my enjoyment of mapping these enormous floors, I was content to sink many hours into the quest to track down Mordred and Princess Jessa. The experience evolves slightly from the game's beginning to the end, but I don't want to spoil the way that it transforms since it's part of the charm of playing it for yourself. I will say that there was more backtracking than I personally would have cared for, but this is one of those experiences like the 7th Saga that you really have to work at to win. It's a hard-fought adventure with lots of surprises that's worth spending some time with, and Shining in the Darkness was a great step into the dungeon crawler genre. It has enough of the traditional RPG shine to feel familiar with some quality of life features like in-game maps for the faint of heart, and I can say that I'm certainly looking forward to more games in this style.